The silence in the Smith household wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of things unsaid. Clara Miller sat at the edge of the mahogany dining table, her fingers tracing a deep scratch in the wood. It had been 6 months since the rainy Tuesday that took her parents, and the world still felt like a radio tuned to static. Montana winters don't just arrive, they invade. Outside the window, the Bitterroot Mountains were already capped in a jagged, unforgiving white. Inside, the heat was a luxury Jackson, her aunt's new husband, treated like a personal affront. Jackson was a man of ledgers and bottom lines. To him, Clara wasn't a grieving niece. She was a variable expense. "The propane bill is up 40%, Sarah," Jackson said, not looking up from his tablet. His voice had that flat, Midwestern edge that made every word sound like a court ruling. "And that's with the thermostat at 62. We've got 3 kids of our own who need to stay warm. We can't keep subsidizing a lifestyle we didn't sign up for." Aunt Sarah fidgeted with her coffee mug, her eyes darting to Clara and then away. She had married Jackson for stability after the accident, but that stability came with a price tag. Clara's presence was the interest she could no longer afford to pay. "Clara," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking like dry kindling. We think, it's time you found your own way. Before the first real blizzard hits next month. You're 16, you're smart. There are youth hostels in Missoula, or maybe work-study programs." "You want me out before the frost?" Clara stated. It wasn't a question. It was the same cold ultimatum her ancestors might have faced on the prairie. "By November 1st, Jackson added, finally looking at her. His eyes were as gray as the Montana sky. "We'll give you $100 and the old sleeping bag from the garage. It's more than fair." Clara didn't cry. The grief had already burned the tears out of her. Instead, she felt a strange, electric spark of her father's stubbornness. The man who spent his weekends sketching thermal gradients and talking about captured energy. As she packed her bag that night, she didn't look for hostels. She looked for her father's old blueprints for a decentralized heating system. If they wanted her to freeze in the Montana cold, she would show them that the Earth had a much warmer heart than they did. The $100 bill Jackson had practically thrown at her felt thin and useless against the biting wind. But Clara knew how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. She didn't head for the Greyhound station to skip town. Instead, she walked 4 miles to Miller's Ridge, a quarter section of scrubland her father had held on to for some day. It was rocky, isolated, and officially hers, the only thing the bank hadn't taken because the soil was too poor for farming. At the local feed and supply store, Mr. Henderson eyed her suspiciously as she slapped her cash on the counter. She didn't buy a bus ticket. She bought a heavy-duty spade, a bag of mortar mix, and 20 clay drainage tiles, the cheap terracotta kind farmers used for waterlogged fields. "You fixin' a leak, Clara?" Henderson asked, tilting his cap. "Something like that," she lied, hoisting the heavy supplies into a rusted wagon she'd salvaged from the roadside. Breaking ground on September 1st was less like construction and more like a fistfight with the earth. The Montana topsoil was a deceptive layer of dust over a backbone of clay and rock. For the first week, Clara was nothing but a machine of sweat and pain. She dug a rectangular pit, 14 feet by 10, aiming for a depth where the Earth's temperature stabilized, nature's own insulation. Her hands, once used to sketching on drafting paper, turned into a landscape of blisters and calluses. Every shovel of dirt was a silent scream against Jackson, against Sarah, against the unfairness of being 16 and alone. But the digging was just brute force. The magic was in the floor. Using her father's crumbling notebook, Clara laid out the clay tiles in a serpentine channel across the dirt floor, connecting a small firebox in the northwest corner to a chimney flue on the opposite side. It was a poor man's version of a Roman hypocaust. The logic was simple physics, but to the locals watching from the road, it looked like madness. They saw a girl burying pipes in the dirt. Clara saw a thermal battery. She angled the tiles slightly downward, just as her dad had noted, to control the draft. She sealed the joints with clay mud, meticulous and obsessive, knowing a single leak would fill her sleeping space with carbon monoxide instead of warmth. Over the pipes, She layered river stones she'd hauled by hand from the creek, followed by a smooth layer of packed earth. It wasn't just a floor, it was a radiator. By mid-October, the Miller Hole, as the town kids called it, was capped with a roof of salvaged timber and sod. It looked like a blemish on the landscape, a primitive mound of dirt. When she went into town for supplies, the whispers followed her. "She's cracked," she heard a woman whisper at the grocery store. "Living like a badger. She'll freeze solid before Christmas. Let them talk." On the night of the first hard freeze, the thermometer outside dropped to 20 degrees. Inside the dugout, Clara lit a small fire. Just 3 split logs. The smoke didn't rush up a chimney to heat the sky. It was drawn horizontally through the buried pipes, dumping its heat into the thermal mass of the floor before venting out. 2 hours later, Clara lay on her sleeping platform. The air in the room was cool, but beneath her, the floor radiated a steady, living warmth. It felt like sleeping on a sun-warmed rock in July. While the town of Elkhorn cranked their thermostats and burned through expensive cords of wood, Clara Miller fell asleep in her dirt fortress, warm, safe, and for the first time in months, victorious. By late November, the Montana sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of snow. The local weather reports were already screaming about a historic Arctic blast pushing down from Canada, sending the residents of Elkhorn into a panic-buying frenzy at the local hardware store. Propane trucks were backed up for miles, and seasoned ranchers were double-checking their generators. But at Miller's Ridge, the silence was absolute. Clara's existence had become a local scandal. It was one thing to be poor. It was another to be visibly strange. On the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, a black SUV crunched up the frozen gravel track leading to her dugout. It was Pastor Stevens from the community church and Mrs. Gable, a wealthy local matriarch who sat on the town council. They hadn't come to visit. They had come to intervene. Clara opened the heavy wooden door she'd fashioned from reclaimed barnwood. A cloud of steam escaped into the biting wind, startling Mrs. Gable. "Clara, honey," Mrs. Gable began, clutching her designer coat tighter around her neck. "We can't let you do this. It's going to drop to 20 below zero this weekend. You're living in a hole in the ground." "It's a dugout, actually," Clara corrected, stepping aside to let them in. "And it's fully insulated." The 2 adults descended the earthen ramp, their faces pinched with that specific brand of pity reserved for the destitute. They expected a damp, freezing cave. What they found stopped them cold. The interior was dim, lit by the soft glow of a kerosene lamp and the embers in the small firebox, but the air was shockingly dry. It didn't smell like mud. It smelled like warm stone and pine. "This is primitive," Pastor Stevens said, eyeing the dirt walls reinforced with sod blocks. "Clara, the church has arranged a place for you. The Henderson family needs a live-in nanny. You'd have a room in the attic, real heat, a real bed." "I have real heat," Clara said, her voice calm. She knelt and placed her hand on the packed earth floor. "Take off your gloves. Touch the ground." The pastor hesitated, then crouched, placing a reluctant palm against the floor. His eyes widened. The earth wasn't cold. It was radiating a steady, deep warmth, like a paved road after a long summer day. "It's radiant heating," Clara explained, the engineer's daughter coming alive in her tone. "The smoke from the cooking fire doesn't just leave. It travels through clay tiles under the floor first. It charges the thermal mass. I haven't added wood to the fire in 3 hours, and the floor is still 80 degrees. Mrs. Gable shook her head, dismissing the physics she didn't understand. "It's dirt, Clara. You are sleeping on dirt heated by garbage. This is desperation, not engineering. When the blizzard hits, this little science project will fail and you will freeze." They pleaded with her for 20 minutes. They offered charity. They offered pity. But they offered it on the condition of her surrender. They wanted her to admit she was helpless. But Clara knew something they didn't. The temperature in the dugout hadn't fluctuated more than 2 degrees in a week, regardless of the wind outside. "I appreciate the concern," Clara said, standing firm by her door. "But I'm safe here. safer than I would be in a drafty attic. Pastor Stevens sighed, handing her a card with the church's emergency number. Stubbornness won't keep you warm, child. Call us when the cold gets in. Don't wait until it's too late. They left her there, driving away in their heated car, shaking their heads at the tragedy they were sure was about to unfold. Clara watched their taillights fade into the gray dusk. She felt a flicker of fear, the human instinct to doubt oneself when the whole world says you're wrong. But then she went back inside, closed the heavy door, and took off her boots. She walked barefoot across the heated floor, the warmth seeping into her soles, grounding her. The forecast called for the storm of the century. Clara threw one extra log into the firebox and waited. The test was coming. The storm didn't just arrive. It slammed into the valley like a freight train derailment. The weathermen called it a bomb cyclone, but to anyone caught in it, it was simply white darkness. By midnight on December 14th, the ambient temperature had plummeted to 25 below zero, with wind chills that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Down in the dugout, the world was strangely silent. The 4 feet of earth above Clara's head didn't just insulate against the cold. It muted the screaming wind to a dull, rhythmic thrum. Clara sat cross-legged on her sleeping platform, wearing only a light sweater. She wasn't surviving. She was living. She cooked a pot of chili on the small firebox, the aroma of cumin and beans filling the small space. Every time the fire crackled, the heat was drawn down into the floor, banking itself in the stones beneath her. The thermometer on the wall read a steady 68 degrees. She turned a page of her book, warm and bored, while the world above ended. 2 miles away, inside Jackson's sprawling 2-story colonial, the situation was catastrophic. It started when the power grid failed at 2 a.m. Without electricity, the blower on the high-efficiency gas furnace died instantly. The silence that followed was terrifying. Jackson's house, built with high ceilings and grand windows, was beautiful to look at but structurally indefensible against this kind of cold. Within 4 hours, the interior temperature dropped to 40 degrees. By dawn, it was freezing. They huddled in the living room under a mountain of down comforters, Jackson, Sarah, and their 3 kids. But the cold was invasive. It seeped through the outlets, under the baseboards, a relentless pressure that found every weakness. "I can't feel my toes," whispered Leo, the 7-year-old, his teeth chattering with a sound that rattled Sarah to her core. His lips were turning a pale, waxy blue. Jackson stared at the dead fireplace. They had a decorative gas insert, useless without power. He looked at his expensive house, his asset, and realized it was nothing but a tomb of drywall and glass. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced his arrogance. He knew, with a sickening clarity, that if they stayed here another night, they wouldn't wake up. "We have to go," Jackson said, his voice ragged. "Go where?" Sarah cried, clutching Leo. "The roads are gone, Jackson." "To the ridge," Jackson said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. To the girl. The journey was a nightmare blurred by adrenaline. Their SUV made it a mile before sliding into a snowbank, burying itself to the axles. They had to walk the last mile. It was a death march through a white void. Jackson carried Leo, shielding the boy's face with his own coat, while Sarah dragged the other 2 children forward, screaming over the roar of the wind to keep moving. They found the dugout only by the faint depression in the snow where the entrance ramp lay. Jackson, his eyebrows frosted with ice and his lungs burning, fell against the rough wooden door. He didn't knock. He hammered on it with a desperate frozen fist. "Let her be there. Please God, let the hole be warm." Let. The door groaned and swung inward. The sensation was immediate and physical. A wall of heat rolled out to meet them, smelling of wood smoke and chili. It was 70 degrees colliding with 30 below, creating a sudden cloud of steam. Clara stood in the doorway, a book in one hand, silhouetted by the golden light of the kerosene lamp. She looked at the huddled, shivering mass of people. The uncle who had counted her cost, the aunt who had looked away. She saw the frost on their eyelashes and the terror in their eyes. Jackson looked up at her, his pride stripped away by the wind, leaving only a terrified father. He couldn't speak. He just reached a trembling hand toward the warmth radiating from the floor. Clara didn't ask questions. She didn't gloat. She simply stepped back and widened the door. "Get in," she said. "Close the door. You're letting the heat out." The dugout was small, barely 140 square feet, but for the next 72 hours, it was the only place in Elkhorn, Montana that mattered. As the bomb cyclone raged outside, burying the county under 4 feet of drift and snapping power lines like thread, the dynamic inside the Miller hole shifted permanently. Jackson sat on the floor, his back against the sod-lined wall, holding a tin mug of hot herbal tea Clara had brewed. He wasn't the imperious, budget-obsessed landlord anymore. He was a refugee in a kingdom he hadn't understood. He watched Leo sleeping soundly on the raised platform, his cheeks flushed with warmth, not fever. The air in the dugout was a steady 65 degrees, fueled by nothing more than the small cooking fire Clara used to heat their beans. "It's just waste heat?" Jackson asked, his voice quiet, almost reverent. He ran his hand over the warm clay tiles embedded in the floor. "You're heating this whole place with the exhaust smoke I usually just vent out of my chimney?" "Energy is only waste if you let it go," Clara said, adjusting the damper on the flue. She didn't sound like a bitter teenager. She sounded pragmatic, resilient, and years older than 16. She sounded like her father. "The earth holds it. The stone stores it. It's not magic, Uncle Jackson. It's just physics. You were trying to fight the cold with money. I decided to work with it. For 3 days, the dugout was a life raft. There was no internet, no electricity, no social hierarchy. Just a family, a pot of chili, and a floor that refused to get cold. When the storm finally broke on December 17th, the silence outside was deafening. They emerged into a blindingly white world to find a town in crisis. Jackson's expensive colonial house stood on the hill, a frozen monument to inefficiency. Inside, his pipes had burst, and the interior temperature was a deadly 18 degrees. But his family was alive. The shame that had driven Jackson to Clara's door turned into something else: humility. He didn't just apologize. He asked to learn. He realized that Clara hadn't just built a shelter. She had built a solution. In the months that followed, the narrative in Elkhorn flipped. The crazy girl in the ground became the town's most sought-after consultant. By February, with Clara's guidance and drawings, Jackson had retrofitted his own home with a supplemental masonry heater and thermal mass flooring. He wasn't the only one. Half the town came knocking, hat in hand, asking how to capture the heat they had been throwing away. Clara didn't charge them for the knowledge. She gave it away. She proved that the most valuable resource during a winter storm isn't propane or a generator. It's ingenuity. She stayed on her ridge, eventually building a beautiful, earth-burned home that became a landmark of sustainable design. She had been cast out to freeze, but instead, she had become the flame that kept the community warm. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Would you have opened the door for the family that kicked you out, or would you have kept the warmth to yourself? It's a hard choice between justice and mercy. If this story of resilience and turning the tables warmed your heart, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have more stories of underdogs who outsmart the odds coming up next. Don't miss out.